Welcome grade 12s. Welcome to genetics part 2. In this lesson we want to understand what is genetics. In order to understand what genetics is, we need to understand what is the meaning of the word heredity. When we speak about heredity, we are speaking about the transmission or the transfer of characteristics from a parent to an offspring. What is heredity? It is the transfer of characteristics from the parent to the offspring. Now, the study of genetics, children, want to find out how these characteristics are going to be passed on from the parents to the offspring. Right? So, what is genetics? Genetics is the study of heredity, or it's the study of inheritance of these characteristics. Genetics wants to study, it wants to find out how these characteristics now are being inherited or passed on from the parents to the offspring. What are some of the examples of characteristics that we are speaking about? Some of the characteristics that can be passed on from a parent to an offspring. Yes, the most common ones are the color of the hair. Some people have brown hair, others have black hair, while others have blonde hair. When we look at the color of eyes, some people can be brown-eyed, while others can be gray or blue-eyed. When we talk about a cleft chin, we are referring to a chin with a Y-shaped dimple in the middle, right? Some people may have that cleft chin, while others will not. Some people may have a widow's peak, while others will not have the widow's peak. What is the widow's peak? It's that V-shaped point on the person's hairline. See, this has a V-shaped point. This one is not that sharp at the front. Can you see? It doesn't have a V shape. So, some people may have the widow's peak, others will not. Some people may have dimples on their cheeks, while others will have no dimples. Some people have freckles, while others don't have any freckles. Some people may have free lobes. Others may have attached earlobes. The attached earlobes are connected directly to the head, while the free earlobes hang down below the point of connection. These are some of the characteristics that can be inherited from a parent to the offspring. Let's move on to terminology. The first term that I would like to introduce you to is alleles. Now, children, before we understand what an allele is, I want you to think back to your lesson on meiosis. During meiosis, you were introduced to homologous chromosomes. Do you remember that? Here's a pair of homologous chromosomes, right, lying next to each other. They are also known as homologs. Now, on these homologous chromosomes or on these homologs, you will find that they have genes. So the gene that's in this area here of one partner, one homolog, there's also another gene at the same position on the other partner or on the other homolog. The gene that's in the partner at the same locus. Locus is the point in which a gene is situated on a chromosome. So the one on the same locus as the partner is known as the allele of the other. Now we must remember, we get a pair of alleles. Why? Because, children, there are always two genes controlling every single characteristic in our bodies. Where are those two genes coming from? One of the gene is maternal, while the other gene is paternal, meaning one of your genes are coming from mom and the other is coming from dad. And those two genes together are controlling a certain or a particular characteristic. Now, both these alleles can be identical, children, but we need to understand that there's a big difference between coding for the same characteristic and being identical. What does coding for the same characteristic mean? It means coding for the same characteristic like eye color, hair color, shape of the nose, shape of the ears. But when we speak about identical will mean if one is coding for blue eye color, then the other must also code for blue eye color. If one is coding for black hair, the other will also be coding for black hair. If one is coding for a sharp nose, the other will also code for a sharp nose. So what am I trying to say? If both of them are coding for the same characteristic, right, it means that they are identical in that way. If they are both coding for blue eye color, then it means that they are identical in that. So that's what it means when I say both alleles can be identical. So the one is the allele to the other and vice versa. Okay, now let's take a look at how this all fits in, right? Now, terminology is very important, learners. Once you understand the terminology, everything becomes much clearer. Okay, so if we look at this slide, we will notice that we see genotype as being capital B, and phenotype reads brown eyes. Now, what is a phenotype and what is a genotype? Right. When we speak of the word genotype, listen, genotype. What am I referring to? Very good. I'm referring to the genes. So the key word in the word genotype is the genes. It's what's inside the person. It's the person's genetic makeup. If I'm looking at you, I cannot see your genes. I cannot see your genotype, right? Genotype refers to your genes. It refers to how your genes are coding. For example, are they identical or are they different, right? And if your genes in the genotype are identical, we refer to them as being homozygous. And if they are different, we say that it is heterozygous. In this example, we see that the genotype is capital B. So they are identical. And if this is the case, we say that they are homozygous. But if the genotype is capital B, small b, in this case, we refer to it as being heterozygous. Now let's look at the word phenotype. If I'm looking at Lerato here, I will notice that Lerato's phenotype says brown eyes, right? And if I look at Anthony, his phenotype also says brown eyes. When I look at David, his phenotype reads blue eyes. So when I speak about phenotype, children, what am I talking about? Yes, phenotype refers to something that I can see outwardly. Phenotype does not refer to whether he is homozygous or heterozygous. For phenotype, for physical characteristics, for features. Phenotype refers to the physical characteristic or the features of the person. The phenotype explains to us how this gene now is going to be expressed on the outside of the person, how it's going to show itself outwardly in the person. If I look at Anthony, his genotype is capital B, small b. Although I can see his genotype means that Anthony is heterozygous for brown eyes, I can't see it on the outside, okay? We can't see whether he is heterozygous or whether he is homozygous, but I can see whether Anthony has brown eyes or whether he has blue eyes. And that is what phenotype is. It's how the person appears outwardly. That brown eyes, that blue eyes, right, is the phenotype or the physical appearance we are talking about. So let's recap. What is the difference between homozygous and heterozygous? Right? Homozygous is when the allele and the gene are identical for a particular characteristic. If that's the case, when the gene and the allele are both identical for a particular characteristic, we say that the person is homozygous for that characteristic. Example, capital B, or small b. These are a homozygous representation of a certain characteristic. If we look at a heterozygous condition, in this case, both the allele and the gene are different for a particular characteristic. If that's the case, we say that the person is heterozygous for that particular characteristic, and a heterozygous condition can be represented differently with a capital B and a small b. Now let's look at the difference between the genotype and the phenotype. When we spoke of genotype, what was it referring to? Genotype refers to the genes of the individual, the genetic constitution, the genetic makeup of a person. And genotype are either homozygous or a genotype can be heterozygous for a certain characteristic. If we look at a person's phenotype, we are talking about for phenotype, for features, for physical characteristics. We are talking about the person's outward appearance for a particular characteristic. Example, look at Gugu's black hair. Black hair is a phenotype. Look at Tandi's long ears. Long ears is a phenotype. Look at the witch's crooked nose. Crooked nose is an example of a phenotype. Moving on. In addition to those terms, we also notice terms like dominant and recessive genes. What is a dominant gene? What is a recessive gene? Now, when we speak about dominant in English, dominant comes from the word dominate. Dominate means to overpower, to overshadow something or someone. In life sciences, when we speak about a dominant gene, we are referring to a stronger gene, the overpowering gene, the gene that overshadows another gene in genetics. Okay? It's the dominant gene that will be the one gene that dominates over another gene. The gene that is going to be dominated by the dominant gene, the gene that's going to be overshadowed or overpowered by the dominant gene, we refer to that gene as the recessive gene. The overshadowed, the overpowered, the hidden gene. So when the dominant gene is present, there's not going to be any hope of the recessive gene showing itself. Right? When the dominant gene is present, the other one has no chances of showing itself. Example, let's look at this gene coding here for brown eyes. Now the gene coding for brown eyes, capital B, is present in Anthony. And the gene coding for blue eyes, which is small b, is also present in Anthony. But when I am looking at Anthony, what do I see? I see brown eyes. So what happened? When the dominant gene, see the capital B for brown eyes? When the dominant gene, which is the brown eye gene, is present, what happened? Automatically, the recessive one is going to be overshadowed. So the one that's going to end up showing in the person will be the dominant one. In this case, it is brown eyes. So always remember, children, that when the dominant gene is present, when the strong one is present, we cannot see the weaker gene outwardly in the person. Let's look at David's genotype, which is small b. There's no capital B present there, right? There's no capital B which represents the brown eyes present in David's genotype for eyes. So when there's no capital letter present, it means no dominant gene is present. Then the recessive will now show itself in the person, and then we can see David's blue eyes. So the recessive characteristic children, which is the blue eyes, can only show itself phenotypically when it is in homozygous recessive form. Meaning, two small letters. If this letter was in a capital, we will not see the recessive characteristic, which is the blue eyes. We will eventually see brown eyes. But because both are in the recessive state, we end up seeing David's beautiful blue eyes. Let's look at some of the examples of dominant and recessive characteristics in our bodies. Let's take a look at some of the dominant and recessive traits. Let's look at the characteristic of eye color, right? The dominant trait would be brown eyes, while the recessive will be blue eye color. The hair color, when it comes to the characteristic of hair color, the dominant trait can be the dark hair, while the recessive trait can be the blonde hair. The characteristic of hairline, you find that the dominant trait is the widow's peak, right? The one with the V-shape hairline, and then the recessive trait would be the smooth hairline. Lips, thicker lips are dominant over thinner lips are recessive. The ears, if you look at the ears, the dominant traits would be when the ear lobes are hanging freely, while the recessive trait will be the attached to the head earlobes. When we look at the tongue, you will notice that the dominant trait is the ability to be able to roll the tongue, while the recessive trait will be the one that cannot roll the tongue. Now we must remember that in some cases, right, the recessive can actually be more popular than the dominant trait. Example what? Example deafness. Deafness is a dominant gene, yet there are less deaf people than normal hearing people in the population. The dominant one is not the one that's always most popular or more frequent in the population.